Hello and welcome to the latest BMJ Known Unknown seminar. I'm Kamran Abbasi. I'm executive editor of the BMJ, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar today. We have a really wonderful panel, some great data to share with you, as well as many literary references. The theme for today is aging and death in COVID. And we're very grateful to Allyson, Pollock and George Davey Smith, who have organised this session for us with help from the team at the BMJ and Richard Smith, who you'll hear from later. This series of COVID Unknowns has been running since November of 2020, when George Davey Smith wrote an excellent editorial in the BMJ, capturing the essence of known unknowns in relation to COVID. And we've been covering the major themes ever since on a regular basis, at least every month. And those previous webinars are available on the BMJ's YouTube channel to watch afterwards, as will this one as well, once we've finished. So today we're talking about aging and death. When I checked the Worldometer data just this morning, it recorded over 4 million deaths around the globe, with some relation to COVID-19. And that's a remarkable toll. It's also many, many stories of people dying in ways that we wouldn't describe as good deaths, dying alone in intensive care units, unable to say goodbye to their families, dying with their families in villages across Asia and Africa, but without any supportive medical or nursing care available to them. We're going to explore all of those themes and more over the next 2 hours. We do want to ask you to ask as many questions as you want. We'll try and answer them for you, either directly. So if you leave your questions in the Q&A box, we will answer them if we can in the Q&A box. We will keep a selection of them for the panel to answer at the end, in the final session of today's webinar. So, without further ado, I am going to hand over in a moment to George Davey Smith, but I want to just tell you two things. One, as I said, this webinar will be available on YouTube once it's finished. Secondly, do share on social media using the hashtag COVID Unknowns. And again, leave your questions for us to answer and for the panel to answer in the Q&A box. I hope you have a good next 2 hours with us. It'll be very packed with data, packed with literary references. And now over to George Davey Smith.
Thanks very much, Kamran. And it's my pleasure to introduce first Kate Clanchy, who's a teacher and a writer who's going to talk to us about an account of 2 deaths during the pandemic. So over to Kate.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now. I think I must be a literary reference because I certainly don't have any data for you, nor have I had many encounters with maths, nor am I any kind of doctor. I'm here to tell you about the deaths of my parents, who were 2 of those statistics in January, so it's a very typical time to die, and they were aged 82 and 84, and they had a range of other conditions. So I think in many ways they're typical of people who died with COVID. I don't think anyone likes being typical. So my PowerPoint has also not got any, I'm trying to maximize this, but it's not working. There we go. My PowerPoint is just photographs because I haven't got any figures for you, and I do want you to think of them as people. And it starts with photographs of my parents as young people, because I think that's another thing that we forget, that old people begin to look alike. They certainly look alike to the doctors that sweep down the wards, looking at so many white heads, so many withered bodies. But once upon a time they were not. So that's my father, Michael Clanchy, who's so handsome in his years at Oxford that his friends would trail him around like bait to see what they could catch. He was a very distinguished medieval historian who wrote books that changed the way that people study literacy. He was a friend of Ivan Illich. I've seen people talking about Ivan Illich for this seminar. He suffered from depression from the age of 50. He wanted to die many times. He also had various conditions. He had bladder cancer. He had Parkinson's at the end of his life. And that's my mother, Joan Clancy. That's when she'd just become a head teacher. She was only in her 30s. She became a famous head teacher. She ran the North London Collegiate, which is a very big, famous girls' school. She was on government committees. She brought down a Tory minister for defying him over his really terrible ideas about the curriculum. Even in age, she was governor of our local primary. She ran a chess club. She was a head of the community. She was an important person in our community. But that's them last year. And you can see, my mum used to say, oh, we can't, they used to totter off. They were very brave. They always went out. My mum used to say, we look like the old people's sign these days, because she was bent over her relator, and my dad was bent over his stick. He has a dystonia. You can't see that there. So his neck looked broken. He was, or as if he was very ashamed or something. He was looking at the ground all the time. He's pulling up his head in that picture. Up to 2021, things were getting harder and harder. And I think the prolonged age that most people suffer in this country is very hard on everyone, not least the daughter around the corner, which was me. But they were surviving. They were held up by a network of lovely neighbours and all the excellent community contacts that they made by being such nice people. And they went out frequently to the vegetarian cafe. Their circles were getting smaller, but they were still making them. They went for walks. They talked to people. People came in to see them every day. So they saw people every day. When COVID came in 2021, when it first came in March, I wasn't actually supposed to see them anymore. And I have to say that I didn't take that rule seriously, even for one day. I broke quarantine and went to see them every day. One unusual thing about my parents was how often they talked about death. This wasn't a kind of an impulsive thing. This was something that had gone on throughout for as long as I knew them. I think they were atheists. They brought me up to be an atheist. And that's quite a comforting position. The complete certainty that when you die, you're going to be dead is quite cheerful, really. But they became more and more and more concerned with the possible manner of their death, because they saw people they loved, friends their age. My parents-in-law, for example, died truly horrible deaths. They were particularly afraid of dementia. They were particularly afraid of going in a care home. They had more advanced decision documents, I think, than probably anyone in Britain. This is just one of my dad's. You can see his beautiful handwriting, learnt in the monastery, and his elegant phrasing. In any medical treatment which I receive, I wish its outcome to be that I should die at home, or at worst in a hospice, and certainly not in a hospital. Whenever they went places, they took these documents with them. When COVID arose, I think that they had a moment of thinking, maybe this is it. Maybe we'll be allowed to go. Because my mum always talked about when she went into hospital with pneumonia and how strongly she was listening to the radio and hearing that someone her age, Alexander Walker, had died, and how strongly she wished she'd been allowed to die too. It's been about 3 years before. I think one moment they thought, oh, maybe this will allow us to go. But then I think they also thought, oh God, this sounds like a really terrible death. So they added an extra layer of COVID-19 advanced decisions. So in addition to the 3 or 4 they already had, lodged with the lawyer, lodged with the GP, stuck in different documents, lodged with me. I had full medical power of attorney as well as the other power of attorney. They added these ones. And you can see what's happening to my dad's beautiful handwriting there. That he can't write, he's getting Parkinson's. And so we had the fun of having Parkinson's diagnosed over the phone. And that was on the fridge. That was in case they were taken away in an ambulance. And it stated that they were not to go away in the ambulance and they wanted to stay at home. And it was a matter of great anxiety to them about how that could possibly be managed. And it was a matter of great anxiety to me because it was clear that I'd have to do it. They didn't actually have to use these documents for an entire summer. We managed to get through the summer. It's sort of boiling the frog, really. It got harder and harder and harder. I felt more and more and more isolated. More and more little things started happening until eventually in November, my mum went into hospital with, I think, a flare-up of her lupus, but at the time they weren't sure about that. And it was, what was happening. That was not when there was a lot of COVID around, but my mum was taken away and we weren't able to see her. She was 3 days in a special place they have in our local hospital called the Emergency Medical Unit, which is a place with no phone connection, where people don't answer the phone either. So you can't get in touch with your loved one at all. I mean, it relies on, in normal times, on you sitting there in shifts, which is what I always used to do in the many times she'd been there before. This time she was actually shut in, and I could only get news of her, whether she was alive or dead, by making multiple complaints to the patient liaison service. She just about survived that, but we couldn't do what we normally did with her, which was put her in the nice local nursing home so that she could be rehabilitated, because she'd be too lonely. So she came home, and when she came home, it was obvious that her mind had taken a big battering and her body had taken a big battering. And we had some terrifying weeks leading up till Christmas. And then just past Christmas, she had very weak skin from years of steroids from her lupus. She got an infection. And then we called the doctor because we thought we had to. And the doctor sent a paramedic, and the paramedic said, her heart's going a bit funny. I want to take her into the day ward to have an assessment. And she promised us it was only the day ward, and my mum was taken in. And then she just disappeared. She disappeared into the emergency medical unit. I got that news, but nobody would tell me if she was alive or dead, why she was in the emergency medical unit, or anything else. So I phoned and phoned hundreds and hundreds of times. And then in the end, I despaired. And at 3 a.m, someone phoned me up and said, your mum, well, I thought they said, your mum, we're going to cut off your mum's leg. I think, in fact, they were just abrading a bit of it. And I said, and then they said, she won't survive, probably won't survive. And I said, my mum has got many clear advanced decisions about this. She doesn't want to do this. And they said, oh, well, we're working with her, so this is what we're going to do. And it was 3:30 a.m, and I didn't do very much else about it. I was too terrified and frightened. And then so my mum was taken into intensive care, and I couldn't, and I started the very next morning sending in these documents back to intensive care to say, please, these are all the documents that we signed all of these different times. And I got onto a nice doctor in the intensive care unit who said, yes, well, your mum, that's right, your mum is dying here. What we're going to do is take her out of the coma, and you can come in for your end of life visit. And that's my dad at the end of life visit. And what he's actually doing at that point is getting COVID-19. So my mum didn't actually die. They said goodbye. It's all unbearably moving. And then we went home, and then it was a further 10 days before she died, during which I had to beg every day for information, and maybe we wouldn't get it. And if I was given information, my brother wouldn't be able to. I was only able to speak to her 2 or 3 times. And my dad got COVID. Now, he'd had a vaccination, so he didn't get a very bad dose, but he became very ill and depressed. He had these other conditions. And my mum died. I was able to speak to her once or twice before she died. I tried to speak to her encouragingly, but she died on her own. My brother's last contact was being told to go away because I'd spoken to him already, so that would be too much contact for one day to be allowed. And then my father, 2 days later, woke up having had a stroke, apparently, or he seemed collapsed. One half of his face was collapsed. I rang up the doctor and said, my father's had a stroke. And the receptionist said, oh, well, you'll have to call the ambulance. And I said, no, I've got his advanced decision. I'm not going to do that. And she said, well, you can't have any help. And I said, okay, I won't have any help. Can you tell the doctors? And then the doctors came around and they agreed that he would be allowed to die. But I genuinely didn't have any help. So I was on my own for 10 days. As he died, the district nurse came around with morphine and things, and he died 10 days later, and they put a broken heart on his death certificate. And I don't know, so my parents died of COVID-19, and I hear about them in the news as statistics. And I hear about them through social media and so on as a tragedy. And people say things like, each death, you must feel like it, like, you know, like a plane load of people went down. But I remember my dad saying to me, I don't feel like I'm on a plane because I wouldn't be able to get on a plane. I'm at the end of my life. My parents weren't spared anything by lockdown, I don't think. I think they would have both died that year, whether they had COVID or not. If anything, COVID was my father's friend by weakening his heart because he didn't want to live and suffer any longer. And I don't really find them in the news, and I don't find any way of counting the harm that was done to us and counting the harm of that I'm suffering now, that I wake up every morning and think that my mother died on my own and I let her down, that I let her suffer that much at the end of her life when I promised her so much often that I wouldn't let that happen. And I think about other people that want to have their parents at home and how terribly hard that was and how much more help is needed if people are going to be allowed to die at home. But at least he died the way he wanted, and at least I was there. So I suppose I'm here at this seminar to say these are some of the real things and these are real harms that are done to our family. And I don't know how long they will carry on happening, but I think it might be a long time. I've talked too long, so I'm going to stop.
Well, thanks so much, Kate. That was really moving tribute to your parents and to the situation that the people have been in, and brings home the difference between sort of statistical lives and individual lives. And we're going to move from that to Danny Dorling, who's going to come from the other extreme, as it were, and we'll be talking about statistical lives.
Thank you, George, and thank you, Kate. So we're going to go now from two people, Michael and Joan, to thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. I've been asked to talk about age and dying from COVID at an international perspective. I'm going to start with a couple of quotes. And this series of seminars is about known unknowns. And I think these two quotes tell you something that we cannot at the moment know the extent of, but certainly it's important that it's said. The first one from a writer for the BBC on the 4th of February of this year. COVID-19 is a mass trauma, the likes of which we have never seen before. Now you may read that and think, that sounds a bit over the top, but a little later, the WHO Director General said the COVID-19 pandemic has caused more mass trauma than World War II. And this isn't just the people directly affected, and the story which we've just heard. This is the trauma of people whose relatives are not directly affected, but who have seen this story over the last year and a half and are very, very affected from it. I'm going to go through the slides quite quickly. If anybody wants to read them and the sources, you can always play this back on YouTube and freeze it. The pandemic is not the only crisis. This little graph is about the GDP change of Western Europe since the 1950s. And you can see it kind of slants in a particular direction as GDP growth goes. And if you look very quickly, then you can see the 1970s, 80s, early 90s recessions, which if you're my age might be important to you and you think these were big things. But in the last 20 years, we've had the most enormous 2008 banking crash. And then the current huge recession we've gone through associated with the pandemic. There are many things going on apart from a pandemic. Almost exactly 2 years ago, I was in London doing a talk about elderly people dying earlier than before. And for me, this contrasts greatly with the attention that we've given the pandemic from the attention we didn't give before. The first time this was noticed was in 2012, when women over the age of 65, their life expectancy from 65 dropped from 20.9 years to 20.7 years. You may think it's small, but that kind of thing generally doesn't happen. The reason for the drop was almost certainly a halving of adult social care spending in the country. People who used to go and visit elderly women who are much more likely to live on their own, and elderly men were no longer employed to do that. The health service was in crisis because of cuts to do with austerity, because of that crash in 2008. If this hadn't happened, and the UK had behaved like other countries, we should expect the life expectancy of elderly women to rise to, say, around about 22. As it was, it kind of stalled. And then with COVID, it fell to 20.2. So inhuman statistical numbers. The UK was unusual. What this table is about is change in life expectancy between years. And if you look down at the bottom, you'll see, for reference, Japan, and this is women, and you'll see a fall of almost half a year to the 3 years, 2009, 2011. That was the tsunami. So an event like the tsunami can have a huge effect on the life expectancy of Japan. Look across the rest of these countries, and these are all the countries that ONS had data for at the time, and you'll see that since 2012, the UK life expectancy was falling and then falling again for women, actually as a whole. Whereas for other countries, occasionally Spain 1 year, Australia 1 year, but in general, they were rising more than they were falling. Going forward for men, you actually see the fall there slightly later for men than for women. And again, falls in Australia and Spain, but they're both smaller, and the year after, life expectancy rises. So we had something going on in the UK, which compared to other countries was bad. But we didn't talk about it. We had no mass trauma. It wasn't seen as particularly important. It was a kind of opposite, if you like, to COVID. COVID was something unknown, something that might affect us all, sort of terrifying thing. These deaths affected people we didn't know, people who are poorer, and particularly elderly women rather than elderly men. This is the rise in mortality between the year 2016-17 and 2017-18. I say at the bottom, it's about a tenth of the rise of wave 1 and 2. Actually, for elderly women, it's about a fifth. And the 90-year-olds are most affected, then the 85-year-olds, the 80-year-olds, and so on. That's austerity. It's argued about. Other people want to claim different things. I say it's austerity. And at the time, we estimated how many people were affected, and all we did is to use the Office of National Statistics projections. And those projections, the ones that were made based on the 2016 data, after life expectancy had really dropped quite a bit from 2014, you just take one away from the other and look forward all the way to 2058. And the Office of National Statistics was saying that they expected, on average, over 1 million people to have their life expectancy reduced. So, and by more than 1 million years. But again, this was in the future, and this is affecting the poor. This wasn't a big issue. This year, 23rd of March, the Health Foundation produces an estimate and says with, by one measure, the 146,000 deaths due to COVID-19 in the UK, up to 1.5 million potential years of life have been lost, with those dying losing up to 10 years of life on average. There's a caveat below in the black text there that says this is the maximal difference. Now, this is a terrible thing that has happened. But in the 6, 7, 8 years before COVID arrived in the UK, we had a similar loss over a much longer time period, admittedly, but a similar loss which didn't register, really wasn't seen as terribly important, maybe was inevitable. Well, could have been flu. The last serious flu we had was 2010. Lower and middle income countries, because I've got stuff in the UK too much. That quote there is from one of the websites that tries to collect data. There is terrible data in lower middle income countries, not age disaggregated. Earlier on in this seminar, the Worldometer, which is the WHO, uses WHO figures, numbers were mentioned. Here's the 1st of July league table, highest number of deaths per million people. It sounds very impersonal when you do this, and you'll see that lower middle income countries are beginning to rise up there. Peru, Hungary, Bulgaria, Brazil, now above Western European countries. The UK and the USA, which at one point led the table, are now 19th and 20th. This is increasingly becoming a disease of poorer countries, just as it's a disease more of poorer areas in richer countries. Known unknowns. We don't understand the age distribution that well, particularly in poorer countries. In Chile, 86% of people who've died at age 60 or more. That's actually relatively young compared to richer countries. In Peru, it's 70% of age 60 or more, meaning 30% are under 60. The USA in particular is different from other affluent countries. Now, we know that the USA is more unequal. We know that the USA has terrible racism, and that has an effect, but it's still been quite a shock to see how different the USA is. This is the most detailed table I'm going to talk about, and it's the ranking from a paper which was published in April 2021. You can see the reference at the very bottom. And I've just sorted it by the proportion of people who have died of COVID who are over the age of 70. And again, we don't know why it's like this, but it's interesting, I think, that it is, and we'll have to know at some point. In Belgium, Austria, and France, 94% of all those who've died have been over 70. Whereas in Switzerland, Sweden, and the Netherlands, and the UK, it's around about 90%. In the UK, only 1% under 50 in the first wave. Less than that, 0.8% under 50 in the second wave. 90% dying over 70. Germany lower, Portugal lower, Japan a bit lower, Spain and Italy lower, and then the jump from 86% being over 70 to 81, and the USA standing out as very different. And then Ukraine, which I'll say nothing more about, but it kind of gives you a sense of just what isn't known. Is this an error in the data in Ukraine, or is there something very different going on? Here's the age distribution of deaths that we saw really early on by May the 16th, 2020. We knew how concentrated it was in people who are older, and the green bars are men, and how much higher. So the mirror image of the austerity deaths, the two in a way equal each other out. The graph on the right is the same, but drawn on a log scale. Britain has some of the, well, sounds odd to say it, but highest quality data about these things. And partly because of that high quality data, because we have a random survey of the population now reporting every week on Friday from ONS and React as well from Imperial College, we know how many people over 70 test positive 2 weeks before we can look at people dying. This is an article George Davey Smith and I published in December of last year, showing how remarkable the correlation was between the proportion of people over 70 who are testing positive and then the number of people who are dying 2 weeks later. Other European countries do not have this data. They do not have a random survey of the population, so you cannot see. But for knowing COVID deaths overall, it was just really crucial to know the prevalence in the elderly population. At the moment, the elderly population have one of the lowest, I think it's incredibly low rate of positive cases.
You've got 30 seconds left, Danny.
That's great. I've got 2 slides, George. ONS are interesting over this. This is their regular publication and the COVID 2 waves, which you'll all recognise. But in recent weeks, they've added deaths from influenza and pneumonia. And if you look very recently, you'll see how much higher, how many, many times higher those are. Influenza and pneumonia, usually not including COVID at all, as opposed to COVID. ONS are very careful. They don't say things, but they just change the graphs they include, I think, to send a message through. And my final map, international map, and this is death rates worldwide about towards the end of 2020. There are so many known unknowns. And one thing, perhaps the most important thing we do not know, is why some of the oldest countries in the world with the oldest populations, in particular Japan, but almost all of Southeast Asia, why they've had rates that are still so much lower than, say, some of the best places in Europe, Finland and Iceland. And it isn't simply wearing masks and population control. Something else is going on. I hope that's of some use. Thank you.
Thanks, Danny. And I'd just like to remind people to put any questions or comments or whatever in the Q&A, and then they'll be discussed at the end. And we have an extended discussion and questions period. I'd like to introduce Carol Brayne now from the University of Cambridge, who's going to talk about compression of morbidity, fact or fantasy?
Thanks very much for inviting me. So in the very short time that I've got, I'm going to go through the concept of compression of morbidity. And this slide shows the dramatic increase. And in many ways, I'm sort of providing data from before the period that Danny has been talking about. So this is not focused on COVID, and COVID's impact is yet to be seen. But this shows the very dramatic rise in the proportion of people at older age groups in populations around the world that has occurred and is anticipated over the next decades. COVID will make a slight dent, but it would still be likely to be roughly like this across time. So these are classic demography figures, and a different way of looking at life expectancy. So that's an increasing proportion of older people, is looking at life expectancy at one point in time. And this is an exercise which was done for a selected range of countries a few years ago. And this shows the very dramatic impact, if you estimate life expectancy at one point in time, of wars and major events. And you can see that there's a cluster of countries which are the relatively high-income countries. The US whites are a little bit lower in this graph at the bottom of this cluster of this sort of rope at the top. And then there are the countries which have much lower life expectancies, with all increasing. So all countries are experiencing aging of the population. But the reason why I show this is what's happening at these periods of time, and of course we'll have something for COVID, which shows a dip as well, is that people are experiencing these events at different times in their life course. So that the Second World War is likely to have had a different impact if you're in utero, in early life, in adolescence, early adulthood, middle life, and later life. And we really need to understand that in order to understand how our health plays out in later life. And so this is one way of presenting that type of data. So the concept of compression of morbidity is that we have extended lives, but what we need to know is whether we've extended lives in good health. And this simply provides a kind of conceptualization of it to show you how this might play out. So at the top, we have a kind of idealized life where we, or maybe not idealized, in that we lose our health with a range at a certain point, or we start to accrue morbidity at a certain point, and we're healthy up to that point, and then we die. And if we extend life, we might simply continue that trajectory without any change from how it had been before. But ideally, of course, what you do is push the ill health and the accrual of morbidity later in life, so that before death, we experience a shorter period of ill health. And that's the top there in A is a sort of is very kind of simple in the way that it's presented, but the bottom really presents a bit more nuanced approach, which is, of course, we are aging, and we are probably accruing the processes that then manifest as diseases later on. And that's, of course, the mantra of early detection. But there's also prevention and risk that plays out across our lives. The key dimensions at the end of life, towards the end of life, are cognition, mood, and function, in that they're the things that really drive the quality of life that we have as we experience aging. Of course, physical and mental health play into, mood is a key part of it. Physical health also plays into that constellation, but those are the things that really affect how we live day to day, and as we heard, very movingly. And dementia is a particular focus and area of concern. And this slide simply shows some data from the last century. In fact, it's dementia. It's the same data in both slides. And on the right-hand side, it's a logarithmic scale on the y-axis, which shows you that dementia, in terms of the proportion of people who meet dementia criteria at any given age, rises pretty exponentially with age. So of course it's incredibly important as we reach later life dementia becomes a very important component, which is one of the reasons why with an aging population, it's become such a focus of interest. Well, we have understood that we can modify the risk of dementia. There are lots of risk factors for dementia, and this is an assembly of the international literature, the most robust literature on risk factors for dementia. And you only need a nanosecond to look at this to recognize that these factors are all highly associated with inequalities, global inequalities and national inequalities, within population inequalities, and also that they are influenced by factors far beyond individual behavior. And this is really, really important, and it's really important for compression of morbidity. You'll also notice that a lot of these things have changed, and certainly they will have changed during COVID, but they were also changing across time, such as our exposure to education, our treatment and detection of hypertension, our upstream prevention of smoking, and attention to, recently, physical inactivity. So all of these things have preventive features, as well as those features which are related to medical interventions. So we looked at whether dementia had changed in the population across generations, looking in the early 90s at the prevalence of dementia. Again, that's the proportion of people who have dementia at any given age. And in the same areas, we repeated the study again 20 years later in 2010. So it's actually around the time that Danny was talking about. And so we haven't been able to repeat this again to see whether this change has been continued. But what we found was that the prevalence of dementia in the population had dropped by over 20%, age for age, across those 20 years. So there's a cross-generational reduction in the risk at any given age of dementia. And the same thing was found for incidence. And we hypothesized that this was because there had been huge changes in society that influenced health in later life, in particular cognitive health. So how does this relate to compression of morbidity? Of course, if cognition is one part of it, you've got function and cognition being very key parts. So Carol Jagger in Newcastle worked with the CFAS, with the data that I've just shown you in the population studies from the UK. And what she looked at was the change in life expectancy across those generations. Of course, this is predating Danny's talk. So in those years, there had been an increase in life expectancy in men of 4.5 years. And we were able to estimate how much of that was spent in cognitive impairment-free life expectancy. And you can see that for men, that life expectancy really was with the expectation of free of cognitive impairment. For women, it was life expectancy increased by 3.6 years, and women had an additional gain of cognitive impairment-free life expectancy. So there was a compression of the cognitive disability, if you like, for these generations. And if you look at healthy life expectancy, you can see a similar pattern, although not women didn't have that similar gain. So there was an impression of a compression of morbidity in the English, this is in 3 sites in England, the English population over this period. However, it's not quite so simple. So that's cognitive impairment and healthy, so that's health conditions. These slides show the disability-free life expectancy, and it's the same kind of graph in which you can see men and women. So the total life expectancy change is 4.5 years again, and disability-free life expectancy is 2.6 years for men and 1.9 with disability. And for women, the life expectancy increase was with quite a lot of disability expectation. So that's 3.1 there, making up most of that extra life expectancy. And the severity, what's interesting again is that it's more nuanced than that the severity patterns change. So of the disability increase that occurs, you see the 1.9 carried across here to the 1.9 here, most of it was mild for men and most of it was mild for women. So it's really important that we understand what we mean by compression of morbidity and the measures that we use to understand it. And just to come back to Danny's analysis, when we look at disability-free life expectancy and life expectancy with disability, and by socioeconomic status, and this has just been published for men and women, what you can see, I just really want to, this is total life expectancy, not the changes, but what you can see here is that in the more recent, so CFAS1 is the old study, CFAS2 is the new generation study, what you can see here is that there are quite clear differences across the advantage groups, from most advantaged having the best sort of pattern and the least advantaged having the worst pattern, particularly for women, and that this has been not in any way reduced. If anything, it's been enhanced across time. So that's a kind of sense of compression of morbidity in the UK. So it's really quite nuanced, and we need to understand it, how it affects different parts of the function and the quality of life of older as we live into our older age. But I wanted to show this last slide, which is incredibly important, which is across the world, we are setting off life courses where we have an expectation of those lives not being optimal, that there is stunting in early life. And this means that those individuals are not set off on as it were, with a resilience, with the assets that they need later in life, and to enter older age in a way that would compress their morbidity. I'll stop there. George, I can see you've popped up.
Thanks, Carol. That was fantastically compressed, but understandable and easy to follow presentation. So thanks so much. And I'd just like to remind everyone to put questions, anything, topics for discussion, etc., in the Q&A, which will be discussed at the end. And I'd like to move on to the last speaker for this session, who is Seamus O'Mahony, who is a retired gastroenterologist and author of The Way We Die Now. And he's going to talk about death alone in intensive care.
Thank you very much, George. Right, I'm trying to share my screen, but Carol's is still open apparently. So
yes, if you could turn mine off, thank you.
Okay. So thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this webinar. I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about my background. I'm a gastroenterologist and general physician. I worked for many years in acute hospitals, mainly in Ireland, but also in England and Scotland. I've been a regular visitor over the years to intensive care units to see those patients of mine who were transferred there from the general wards. In that time, I gained some insight into the work of intensive care doctors and nurses. And what I've got to say is not specifically COVID related, because my experience is predominantly predated COVID. Now, this slide shows Ivan Illich, who's already been mentioned by Kate. She mentioned that her father was a friend of Ivan Illich. The word Illichian is used in the title of this talk. Ivan Illich was Austrian by birth, but spent much of his life in Latin America. He was a Catholic priest, a philosopher, a social historian, a polemicist, a public intellectual. Think of Noam Chomsky with a dog collar and you get a rough idea. His core argument was that modern industrialized society robbed people of their humanity, their dignity, and their spirituality. Institutions like education and healthcare were, he argued, counterproductive. Education spread ignorance, healthcare promoted sickness. He wrote many books, the most famous being Limits to Medicine, or Medical Nemesis, which was published in 1975.
Seamus, are you trying to share your slides, or do you not want to?
Sorry, am I not sharing?
No.
All right, let me start again then.
Sorry.
Okay, are you seeing that?
No.
No? Okay, let me go back to Zoom then. I'm here. Share screen. Is seeing that?
Yeah, yeah. It's not in project view, but if you, but yeah, perfect.
Sorry, if it says from the beginning. Is that it? Can you see me now?
Yes, perfect.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. You can see me and the slide, yeah? Okay. So I'll move on quickly. I was talking about Ivan Illich. You heard that bit? Or what else?
We could hear everything. It was just the slides that we couldn't see.
Okay, you could hear everything. Okay, so I told you about Ivan Illich. So his most famous book, Limits to Medicine, published in 1975, opened with the famous assertion that the medical establishment has become a threat to health. Illich's main argument of this book was that modern medicine created what he called cultural iatrogenesis. By this, he meant that it caused people to lose the traditional skills of dying and suffering. And intensive care medicine was in its infancy when Illich wrote this book, and mortality rates were much higher than now. He saw intensive care as the apotheosis of modern medicine, with its technophilia, its deluded mission to defeat death, its elevation of doctors to a priestly caste or caste. This image epitomizes what I might call the Illichian perception of death in intensive care. The person is isolated, alone, drugged to oblivion, sustained by a ventilator, a dialysis machine, multiple drug infusions. Every physiological variable is monitored. So this is the Illichian death, the isolated body as a broken machine. And this kind of image appeared regularly during the COVID pandemic. About half of all deaths take place in acute hospitals. And although most people express a preference to die at home, less than a quarter do so. And only 8% in Ireland die in hospice. In England, it's even less at 6%. What about deaths in ICU? We have some figures for 2019 from Ireland, and the UK statistics are broadly similar. About a sixth of hospital deaths occur in intensive care. Mortality rate is about 14%, and another 7% die after discharge back to the wards. Mortality rates of ICU patients with COVID was much higher than this during the first wave of the pandemic, but fell substantially by the time of the second wave. We talk a lot nowadays about the good death, and many would view dying in ICU as a bad death. But is this true? I would argue that you can have a relatively good death in ICU. It may not be as good as dying at home or in hospice, but it is likely to be better than dying on a general ward. In most people dying in ICUs, imminent death is recognized and active treatment is withdrawn. Diagnosing death, however, as Kate showed us, is not always straightforward. ICUs are calmer and less chaotic than general wards. The Stafford inquiry gave us some bleak insights into death on the wards. ICUs are better staffed with one-to-one nursing. And intensivists usually have a background in anesthetics, so they're good at pain relief. But most importantly, intensive care units now take very seriously their duty to provide decent end-of-life care. Most people admitted to ICUs in Britain and Ireland leave them alive, but this is not the case in many other countries. Atul Gawande described the American experience some years ago. He interviewed an intensivist who reckoned that only 20% of her patients would leave the intensive care unit alive. She called these units warehouses of the dying. Her typical patient was a woman in her 80s with end-stage respiratory and kidney failure. Her husband had died after a long illness with a feeding tube and a tracheostomy, and she didn't want to die that way, but her children wouldn't let her go. A friend of mine who works as a palliative care physician in India told me that in some low-income countries, dying in ICU has become almost a status symbol, a luxury for the rich. ICUs in Britain and Ireland have not yet gone down the American route, but the pressures are mounting. People sometimes end up in ICU because doctors have avoided the difficult conversation. Unlike Kate's parents, very few people admitted to hospital have advanced directives. Families' expectation of outcome can sometimes be unrealistic, and intensive care has been the battleground for bitter disputes between families and hospitals over the past few years, as the cases of Janet Tracy, Charlie Gard, and Alfie Evans have shown. Physicians requesting admission to ICU for patients with little chance of survival can be just as unrealistic. And it may be more cynical than this. It may be about moving on responsibility, about avoiding the difficult conversation. Will Cairns, an Australian palliative care doctor, summed it up well. 2 weeks in intensive care can spare you 1 whole hour of difficult conversation. To conclude, we might not choose to die in an intensive care unit, but it might be a better death than we imagine. Ivan Illich might not agree, but we can combine technology and compassion. I'll finish where I started with Illich. He died aged 76. He had lived for many years with a slow-growing head and neck cancer, which he refused to recognize as an illness. He didn't seek medical treatment, but used instead meditation, yoga, and rather stylishly, opium. He died suddenly at his desk while writing. A friend said that God gave him a beautiful death. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Seamus. That was fantastic. I'm going to hand straight over to Allyson, and we're only 2 minutes behind, so you've got to keep up the good timekeeping, Allyson.
Yes, sir. Thanks very much. Fantastic panel and very moving. We're going straight on now with the denial of death, and we've got Laura Trady from the University of Cambridge.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. Okay, so you should be able.
Great, that's lovely, Laura. Great, we can see it.
Yeah, I just can't see my screen now, but it's okay. Sorry about that. Like, you can see it. Oh, great.
We can see it well.
Yeah, I just couldn't see my own. I don't know how it happened. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. I think my talks connects very well with the one of the previous speaker, as I'm going to talk about the death denial thesis in relation to COVID-19. And this is based on 2 papers that a colleague and I wrote. The first of which explores the origins of the death denial thesis, and the second offers some potential critiques. And I should say my colleague is a historian, and I'm a historian and a social anthropologist, and we both work on death and the medicalization of death. So what is the denial of death Destable thesis? You may be familiar with some version of this formulation. Death is a taboo or is denied in Western societies. And it was especially popularized by a number of authors that you see here. And it became quite popular from the 1970s. And for several decades, it was very influential in sociological and historical analysis of the attitude of Western societies towards death and dying. I should say that nowadays it is generally no longer in use in sociology and in history, so it's no longer sort of a prominent framework, but it has been and it does remain very popular in the public sphere. So you may be familiar with a number of initiatives that aim at confronting this taboo of death, like, for example, the death cafes or the Order of the Good Death. So I think that the death denial thesis can best understood as, let's say, a narrative of fall that compares what death is supposedly in contemporary Western societies with conceptions of death in the past or in other societies. So the thesis goes that death in contemporary in the Western societies is more meaningless. It is highly medicalized, a technologically intensive condition. The dying are segregated. That's a word that recurs in such works. People are unfamiliar with death and unable to talk about it in public. Again, death is conceived primarily in physical rather than spiritual terms, and funeral customs are profit-oriented rather than providing to the psychological needs of the bereaved. So what I find interesting about this formulation is that implicit in the denial of death thesis are a set of assumptions and claims which are often inaccurate about what death was like in the past and in other societies. So in the second paper we wrote, we went on to challenge, or to rather offer some potential challenges to the denial of death thesis. I cannot go into detail now, of course, but one of these is that the factors given in support as evidence of this thesis are very heterogeneous, and there might be alternative, or indeed there are alternative explanations for them. Again, the definition of Western society is very broad because attitudes towards death will be extremely different in the UK, for example, or in Italy. So while based on the literature that we reviewed and based on our own scholarly work on death and dying in the past, it can be safely be claimed, of course, that practices surrounding death have changed. There is no doubt about that. At the same time, this does not necessarily amount to denial, or it does not amount to denial. So while I believe that the thesis is inaccurate as a historical or sociological claim, this does not mean in the least that the thesis is valueless, so to say. Indeed, I think that it does reflect particular assumptions about the past, and above all, particular anxieties about modernity. And why am I saying all this? Because as we have already heard, medicalization plays a particular role in this narrative. So medicalization is often pointed to as a factor contributing to death denial, and it is often portrayed by very important authors in the field of death studies as inherently dehumanizing. So let's have a look at this quote from Kubler-Ross on death and dying, the quote highlighted in blue at the bottom. I think there are many reasons for this flight from facing death. One of the most important facts is that dying nowadays is in many ways more gruesome, more lonely, mechanical, and dehumanized. And let's have a look at how she portrays death in a hospital context. So you can see here that the patient may cry out for rest, peace, and dignity, but he will get infusions, transfusions, a heart machine. He may want a single person to stop and talk to them, but they will get a dozen people all preoccupied with his physical functions, but not with him as a human being. And I would be very interested in knowing what those among you who are medical practitioners feel about this characterization. So here I should stress that I'm talking about death and COVID-19 in the media. So how death during COVID-19 has been portrayed by the media. And I know that individual experiences, as we just heard, might differ completely. So death during COVID-19 did reflect several particular anxieties which are at the core of the death denial thesis. Death has been lonely in the absence of relatives, with relatives being prevented from saying their last goodbye to their next of kin. And indeed, death during COVID-19 has been an extremely physically and let's say technologically invasive moment. So we have heard much about the trauma of being in intensive care and the very technologically invasive procedure of being on a ventilator. But at the same time, I would suggest that in the media, we saw much more nuanced portrayals of medicalization and of technology in relation to death. So much in contrast with Kubler-Ross's account, we have seen, for example, the human qualities of staff and carers being emphasized, And I find these pictures always very interesting because we see medical staff wearing either their name on PPE, or here are cases from Italy in which people working in COVID wards, wrote the name of their favorite footballers on their PPE to be recognizable, but also, as they said, to sort of gain courage, right? And these human qualities or humane qualities of staff and carers became all the more necessary because very often hospital staff had to almost stand in for relatives in the moment of death. And here is a very human, very moving witness from a doctor in ICU who was talking about how he is traumatized by his experiences in ICU. And so you can see here that there is a very physical and emotional connection with the dying, and the doctor gets to think about his own father-in-law as he accompanies this patient in the last moment. Again, in several occasions, medical staff had to become the channel of communication between families and between the dying or the patients. So I like these photos as well because they show how they sort of show staff like standing between and as a channel of communication between the patient and the family at home. And indeed, at times, communication via an iPad, for example, was the only way in which the dying could say goodbye to their families. Again, COVID restrictions did mean that death had to happen behind closed doors. But we witnessed to a real hunger to know what was happening behind these closed doors. And so we saw a number of these articles being published. So inside this hospital, inside a COVID intensive care ward. And I found this infographic on the Telegraph sort of explaining what the various machines in ICU are. Again, personal experiences of doctors, of nurses, of staff became very common in the media. So we have here the life of an ICU doctor, or here at the bottom of the other slide, you can see that staff in intensive care began to film their lives. So I don't know if you did.
Sorry, you have 1 minute left.
Oh yeah, the next slide is the conclusions. Thank you. Yeah, so it was not just the press reporting about intensive care, it was also staff themselves that wanted to share this experience on social media. So in conclusion, I would argue that despite the denial of death thesis has been very popular in portrayals about death and dying in the West, accounts of death and dying during COVID-19 were characterized by much more nuance or like much more nuanced portrayals of medicalization and technology. So I would say that this is everything for now, and I would be really looking forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Laura. So we'll move now rapidly on to terror management theory and the pandemic. Delighted to welcome Sheldon Solomon, who's also an author of Worm at the Core. Over to you, Sheldon. I don't think you're using slides. You're just speaking to us now, aren't you? Not just.
Very good. And thank you, everybody, for a very fine program. I work in an area that is under the rubric of what's called terror management theory. And this is a social psychological theory that was derived from cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker's efforts in the 1970s to delineate the motivational underpinnings of human behavior. Becker was basically interested in, the way he put it, in understanding why people do what they do when they do it. And what Becker does is to combine ideas from evolutionary theory with existential psychodynamic ones. He starts with Darwin, who argued that people are not much different than other forms of life to the extent that every living thing is biologically predisposed to survive, not only in the interests of self-preservation, but also for reproductive purposes. We are, however, as human beings, unique in that our enlarged forebrain gives us the capacity to think abstractly and symbolically to the point where we can literally imagine things that do not yet exist and then have the audacity to transform them into reality. And one aspect of our vast intelligence that Becker emphasizes, and here he's leaning on the existential philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, is that we are so smart that we literally realize that we exist. You can call this self-awareness or consciousness. And Kierkegaard's point is that if you're smart enough to know that you're here, you will necessarily experience two uniquely human emotions that he called awe and dread. It's awesome to be alive and to know it. But it's also dreadful because unless you're a child or an idiot, if you're smart enough to know that you're here, you're also smart enough to realize that your life is of finite duration, that you can die at any time for reasons that you could never anticipate or control, and that you're a breathing piece of defecating meat that is no more fundamentally significant or enduring than a lizard or a potato. What Becker hypothesizes is that the ongoing awareness of the reality of the human condition would give rise to potentially debilitating existential terror that we manage by embracing what anthropologists call cultural worldviews, humanly constructed beliefs about reality that we share with other members of our culture that minimizes death anxiety by giving us each a sense that life has meaning and that we have value. And when Becker talks about meaning, he points out that all cultures have an account of the origin of the universe. They have prescriptions for how we ought to behave while we're here, and some hope of either literal or symbolic immortality to those who behave in accord with cultural dictates. Moreover, all cultures offer social roles with associated standards of desirable conduct that if you meet or exceed them, then you perceive yourself as a person of value in a world of meaning. Consequently, what Becker and terror management theory hypothesize is that we are, whether we're aware of it or not, and mostly we're not, we are constantly fundamentally motivated to maintain faith in our cultural worldviews, as well as confidence of our value in the context of them. Well, this raises the question, is this true? From an experimental and empirical vantage point, the answer is provisionally yes. There are now more than 1,000 published studies, not only by our research group, but by independent researchers in more than 25 countries on 5 continents that provide convergent empirical support for these ideas. And most of them are based on what we call the mortality salience paradigm, which very simply entails reminding people momentarily of their own mortality, perhaps by just asking them to write a bit about their thoughts and feelings about dying. In control groups, we ask people to think about things that are unpleasant but not fatal, having a limb sawed off, having an operation without anesthetic, being embarrassed or ostracized. We also do studies where we interview people in front of a funeral parlor or 100 meters to either side, or back in the lab, we expose people to the word death for 28 milliseconds, so fast that you need not know that death is even on your mind. And what we find is that in accord with Ernest Becker's claims, death reminders have a pervasive influence on human attitudes and behavior. So, for example, people reminded of their mortality are more likely to support and vote for charismatic political leaders. Hitler in Germany, George W. Bush in the aftermath of September 11th, 2001, Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020. We've done many studies showing that death reminders increase support for charismatic leaders. Death reminders increase our discomfort in nature and increase our willingness to exploit nature and exhaust non-renewable natural resources. Death reminders increase our desire for money. It increases our desires for high status luxury goods. Death reminders increase all the pre-existing psychological disorders. And so in the lab, when we remind people they're going to die, phobics become more phobic. OCD people use more soap and water to wash their hands. Socially anxious people hide in a closet longer than under other conditions. Death reminders increase psychological dissociation, which is a known precursor of PTSD. All right, so what does all this have to do with the pandemic? In our view, natural as well as humanly created disasters like September 11th, 2001, and the pandemic, they serve as pervasive death reminders. And so what we would expect and what has been found in the so-called real world are the same things that we find in the lab. And I'll just speak with nominal confidence about what's happening in the United States right now. But we know that in the aftermath of the pandemic, that there are unfortunate and unconscionable increases in racism and xenophobia. We know that in the last presidential election, that President Trump's support was highest where the death rates from COVID were also highest. We know that in the wake of the pandemic, and it's 110 Fahrenheit, 43 centigrade in the Northwest, the roads are literally melting, but it's not stopping people from jumping in their large cars to drive to Walmart in order to save $1 on a machine gun and a lemon. We know that Americans are drinking and shopping in tremendous outbursts of enthusiasm. We know that there are across the board increases in rates of psychological disorders. All right, well, so what? The point that I would make, to be depressing for a moment, and I will finish on time, is that malignant manifestations of repressed death anxiety bring out the worst in us. They render us demoralized, hateful, proto-fascist, plundering the planet in our insatiable quest for dollars and dross in a Facebook, Netflix, Amazon, Twittering, booze, and pill-popping stupor. And Robert J. Lifton may not have been overly hysterical when he said that we may be the first form of life to have the ignominious distinction of being directly responsible for our own extinction. Well, I hope that he is wrong in this regard. And if we had more time, I would turn around and point out that for some folks lucky enough to be healthy and adequately provisioned, that the pandemic may have been an opportunity to metaphorically and literally step back a bit and to reassess what matters in terms of our lives and what might be best for the world around us. And so in conclusion, I like the last line of Albert Camus' The Plague, where he says, we learn in a time of pestilence that there is more things to admire in men than to despise. I sincerely hope that that's true, because I believe that we are about to find out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sheldon, and for ending on a note of optimism. We now have Bettina Husebø speaking about death in care homes. Very relevant. Thanks, Bettina.
Thank you. Thank you, dear Allyson and dear all. I wish to share my slides. So can you see it?
It's just coming slowly.
Yes.
Yes, when you're not on the main slide, you're not on
so, like this?
We can, yeah, that's perfect. Yes. Thank you. Perfect.
Yes. Dear Allyson, dear all of you, I'm delighted to be part of this digital COVID-19 webinar and to talk about death in care homes from a Norwegian perspective. I'm an anesthetist, palliative care physician, and nursing home physician, and I'm a professor at the University of Bergen in Norway and head of the Center of Elderly and Nursing Home Medicine, and I'm related to the Pandemic Center. Norwegian nursing homes played an important role during COVID-19. We have about 700 nursing homes and almost 40,000 places. 80% of those living in a nursing home have dementia, and most develop behavioral disturbances during the course of their disease. Multimorbidity and polypharmacy are common. About 10% of the employees do not have any education. Most are registered or licensed practical nurses, and permanently employed physicians, often general practitioners, are necessary because 56% of the Norwegian dying population deceased in a nursing home. Here we are on the top worldwide. During COVID-19, almost 37,000 people were infected in Norway, and about 800 people died. Most people were 80 years or older. 57% died in a nursing home. Compared to other countries such as the UK, Denmark, or Germany, and compared to our earlier annual death rates, fewer people died in Norway in 2020. This may be explained by increased awareness on physical and mental function, better hygiene, and treatment of other infections such as pneumonia. Norway has a public financed healthcare system, and in 2012, the coordination reform was established, which encouraged healthcare professionals to provide patients with proper diagnostic and treatment at the lowest responsible medical level. When COVID-19 hit the country, the government and experts recommended not to transfer nursing home patients to hospitals because they suggested higher death rates, especially in connection with respiratory treatment of the frail old and people with dementia. They would not tolerate this. However, especially in the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, grotesque situations were registered. This is Karianne Magnussen. She is the head of the Methodist Church Home in Bergen. As hospitals and the university still prepared for the worst case, patients died dramatically in her nursing home, only 200 meters nearby my working place at the university. Most of her colleagues were in quarantine, so she washed both the patients and the staff clothes at night. Comparable to her nursing home, other nursing homes experienced lack of safety, test equipment, and staff training in the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. A retrospective observational study, including 3 out of 10 outbreak nursing homes, demonstrated high death rates, and 30% of all nursing home patients occurred in one of these 10 nursing homes. People were old, multimorbid, and had symptoms of behavioral disturbances, dyspnea, cough, abdominal symptoms, and pain. These early observations triggered immediate actions, such as the development of web-based guidelines for treatment algorithms and regular webinars, systematic medical record systems, limited flow of staff between different wards, and reduced work outside the nursing homes for part-time employed staff members. Further, we tried to increase the focus on palliative care in nursing homes and described how to identify imminent dying, how to introduce and conduct advanced care planning together with relatives, and the assessment and treatment of pain and distressing symptoms in people with COVID and at the end of life. Published recently, the Corona report highlights some of the ethical dilemmas in nursing homes. The total isolation and lockdown is a double-edged sword because infection control increased loneliness and hastened cognitive and physical decline. People with dementia did not understand these changes, and they were unable to provide informed consent to isolation and forced testing. Further, old buildings challenged the infection control. Another important aspect was the disruption of ongoing research. The Live at Home pathway study is a step-wedge cluster randomized control trial to investigate the efficacy of a complex intervention for home-dwelling people with dementia. The intervention, including visiting people with dementia at home, was postponed, but instead we nested the PALM-DEM study into the trial and investigated the use of assistive technology and the situation for people with dementia who are living alone during COVID-19. We found that 74% use technology at home, but this was only traditional stuff. Modern devices are not routinely implemented to support people with dementia living at home in Norway. And we have very bad news for older women who live alone because support services were shut down totally. And these people were not identified or prioritized at all. Even more, they are not mentioned in any report and they do not have a voice. To conclude, we find increased awareness about nursing home medicine, palliative care, and death. But we need better competence around ethics, advanced care planning, and decision-making. We learned more about the value of mental, physical, and social activities, and the potential to implement assistive technology. Many people are successfully vaccinated now, but actually now we are in the post-pandemic period, and we register that it is easier to lock down than to open up again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bettina. Yes, I think that's a common problem in all countries, the easier to lock down than open up. That was very moving. We're now going to go to Kerala in India and talk to Suresh Kumar, who's going to tell us about the Kerala experience. So Suresh, thank you very much. Suresh is in the Institute of Palliative Care in Kerala. Oh, and can I remind you all again just to put your questions in the Q&A, please? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Allyson. Can I start?
Yes, please do. Thank you.
Okay. I have a few slides. Let me share the slide. Okay, is it visible? You can see the slide.
We can. You're not on the full. Yep.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, right. Thank you. See, unlike the previous speakers, I'm focusing on one region, one small region in a country, like Kerala. Many of you know it's a small state in southern India with a population of around 34 million. And like any humanitarian crisis, COVID pandemic also sort of demonstrated the strengths and weaknesses of the system. The way each system responded, where each community responded, it's opened up, or it showed the strength and weakness. So in the next few minutes, what I'm trying to do is to have a quick look at Kerala and the Kerala's response to COVID. Kerala is particularly interesting for two reasons. One, the health indices are much better than the rest of India, or much better than many of the other low and middle income regions. And Kerala also boasts of probably the best community-based palliative care network in low middle income countries. So how did Kerala respond? That is the question. Yeah, when you look at the healthcare system, we are still not out of the crisis. We still have numbers are quite high. we already had 3 million confirmed cases. But something that was very interesting when compared to many other regions in India and also many other countries, all treatment were offered free of cost to patients from the public health system. And then also something that is very interesting, something that we noticed is that the first line defense at the primary healthcare level was quite good, quite effective in that it sort of filtered out the number of patients reaching the secondary and tertiary level. And the secondary, and even at the peak of the crisis, the secondary and tertiary levels were not overwhelmed. When you look at the situation in the rest of India and many other countries, there were stories about the system getting overwhelmed, people not getting beds, oxygen shortage. But in Kerala, it never happened. But mainly, I think because of the strong primary healthcare system and the way it functioned to filter out. And also another very noticeable thing was the social response to COVID. In addition to the response of the healthcare system, the social civil society responded pretty well. The Kerala has, unlike many other places, Kerala has a decentralized governance system, and the local village level councils are quite powerful. They played an active role in all the activities, like forming rapid response teams, forming citizen groups, community initiatives, and then volunteer groups are supporting the health teams, and in tracing contacts, following up people in quarantine, and vigilant neighborhood. Very often, like there were complaints that they were overreacting, but they kept vigilant. And community kitchens providing food for people who can during the period of lockdown. Food for other people, shelter for people. So this is like there was a pretty strong civil society response to the pandemic in Kerala. But on the other side, when you look at the approach to death and dying in COVID, there was a very strong emphasis on prevention of COVID deaths at any cost, both as a government policy and also as a social attitude. Media was in a way celebrating like people surviving COVID, and then like people, the death was looked upon as a failure, and with the two negative implications. One, even people with advanced diseases, patients who were otherwise in palliative care, who were in supportive care, once they get infected with COVID, they were forced to take a different track of what we call the active COVID treatment track. And terminally ill COVID patient also, because the idea was like we should prevent death somehow. And the beds are available. So that's paradoxically that was a main issue when you look at death in ICUs and death in COVID deaths in Kerala. Intensive care units and high dependency units beds were available even at the time of the peak of they were buffered. Like 20% beds were vacant even at the time of the peak level of admission. So which again, from the supportive care point of view, it became extremely difficult to establish a supportive care stream because the policy was to prevent death, and anybody with COVID automatically went to the this COVID active COVID, aggressive COVID treatment stream. And decision making particularly was difficult because the PPE, the barriers in communication, the family, because the infectious disease family not being present. So the system at the entry point, it was very difficult to make decisions. And also very often at the entry point, there was an overworked junior or middle level doctor. And he or she would rather prefer to admit the patient straight away to ICU because that's where, rather than discussing with the patient and family, the difficult conversation, taking on a decision. So that was extremely difficult, particularly the inexperienced staff at the entry point, and also the intensely emotional situation, making even a difficult conversation even very difficult for experienced people. So this made the person sitting there, the doctor or nurse sitting there, automatically decide that okay, let the beds are available, so let them go to the ICU. So this made a lot of difference. And within the ICU, like I've seen a few presentations earlier about the possibility of peaceful death in the ICU, but that would mean the basic manpower, palliative care manpower or supportive care manpower available. So the ICU staff, again, a lot of new ICU beds were set up. and the infrastructure was set up and people were recruited and sent into the ICU to work as staff. So they did not have any training in supportive care or end-of-life care. And hospital, there were hospital-based palliative care available. They were not able to cover the huge number of patients getting admitted to high dependency units and intensive care unit. And in the community, we have a very good palliative care support system. Home care, all the regions are covered by home care, but they were also supporting. They were supporting patients. But once the patient, for example, an elderly person or somebody with a severe comorbidity become positive, people are willing to accept that. But then there was this fear of hypoxia. There were stories about people struggling to get oxygen, people being breathless and all. So many of the family members prepared to take the patient to the hospital. And once they reach the hospital, they automatically get into the what we call the COVID stream. And another issue was about grief and bereavement. We are yet to know what the impact is. But Kerala does not have a formal bereavement counseling system like many of the Western countries. There was very strong social support available traditionally when somebody dies and it continues for a longer period. So we have not seen a lot of pathological grief also in the past. But we were assuming that, okay, the system is capable of doing that. So we don't need a formal bereavement support system. But during the COVID came, the situation changed. For one thing, bodies were directly, unlike the previous time, bodies from the hospital, bodies were directly taken to the cremation ground or burial ground, not going to the house. So this like a lot of rituals were lost, and during and after funeral, quite a few rituals were there, which were like different communities, different religions are there, but they were not able to do that. And also the mandatory social, because when somebody dies, it was mandatory for people in the neighborhood, relatives, friends and relatives to visit and spend time with the family. That has not been possible because the restrictions due to COVID. So we do not know what real impact this is going to make on grief and bereavement system, but we feel that, okay, we have been talking to some of these grieving people, and then there's a definite gap there. So we are going to find the impact in near future. So there were attempts, like this has been, some of these problems were diagnosed or detected during this process. And then there are attempts to incorporate palliative care teams in critical care units. In some other districts, this has been done. And then this hypoxia, fear of hypoxia, community-based palliative care teams have been trying hard to generate making domiciliary oxygen accessible, like oxygen concentrators. So that's again, like we started the process, but it will take time. And there's something that is recently happened is that some of the palliative groups and some of the non-governmental organizations, they have now started a new bereavement companion program, so training people how to be a good companion during bereavement. This has never happened in the state earlier. So this is what. We had a fairly good response to COVID itself, but our response to death and dying was really, like I would say that, terrible, because paradoxically, because the other response was quite strong, and the good death never came into the other part. Thank you very much, and this is my email. I'll be happy to take questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a really interesting talk, as were all the panelists in this session. I'm now going to hand over to Kamran for the final panel. And thanks again, Suresh.
Great. Thank you very much, Allyson. Really fascinating session so far. Thank you to all the panelists. Okay, I'm going to go straight into the next session. And our first speaker is Felicia Marie Knoll from the University of Miami. And Felicia is going to talk about inequalities in care for the dying, the world's biggest global divide. Felicia.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be able to be with you, although I am deeply, as we all are, saddened for so many of the reasons why we are here. I'll go ahead now and share my screen. Can you see all right? If I don't hear otherwise, I assume you'll be able to share the screen just fine.
Yep, it's all working well. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks so much. And thanks in particular to Richard Smith for inviting me and for leading an amazing commission that's delving into some of these issues. I'm going to share primarily with you the results of our Lancet Commission on Global Access to Palliative Care and Pain Relief that was released in 2017 and some of the updates that we've been working on with that data. But let me start here. And I ask you to put yourselves into this space, beginning first with something that was written more than 100 years ago, and thinking of another Ivan Illich with a Y, Leo Tolstoy's in 1886. And Tolstoy wrote, "From that moment commenced the shrieking fit, which lasted for 3 days and was so terrible that it was impossible not to hear that horror even through 2 doors." Now, imagine your final months, weeks, and days of life. And like most in our world, you probably hope to be free of pain. Consider, however, a scenario in which you and those you hold dear face those very painful days with no access to the palliative care that could alleviate your suffering. This is Tolstoy's Ivan Illich, bereft of even opium to calm the fear and agony. But it is today. And is this unimaginable? Probably is, but it is the reality for most of the people who share our world. And hence, this is how we opened our commission report, that poor people in all parts of the world live and die with little or no palliative care and pain relief. Staring into this access abyss, one sees the depth of extreme suffering in the cruel face of poverty and inequity. The abyss is broad and the abyss is deep, mirroring relative and absolute health and social deprivation. I'll go through with you now some of our results, quantitative, and also some of our recommendations, and update them as best we can for now, and thinking of the pandemic we have been and continue to face in so many parts of our world. First, looking at global need and what we called serious health-related suffering. Then a little bit on the intervention that we proposed, the essential package. Talk about unmet need that we can measure through opioid medicines in terms of level and equity, what we call distributed opioid morphine equivalent. And overall and throughout, I'll be telling you about how we can strengthen global and national health systems, what we should have learned and should have done before the pandemic hit. Brief caveat, you're going to see some updates, but the quantitative work is very much in progress. And so the numbers and figures are still approximate and unpublished. What is the global burden of serious health-related suffering today? Our preliminary data for 2019 suggest more than 24 million deaths, which is about half of the 55 million deaths worldwide, and more than 36 million people experiencing serious health-related suffering. We're speaking of non-descendants. So pre-COVID, at least 60 million people worldwide, about 3/4 of them in low and middle income countries, where the infrastructure and offer of palliative care is severely lacking. We looked, and this was largely under the leadership of one of our commissioners, Julio Frank, at how to integrate into universal health coverage palliative care by strengthening health systems. And we looked by function. And we said that without access to palliative care and pain relief, neither universal health coverage nor the Sustainable Goal 3 or any other can in fact be achieved. We looked at 4 functions of health systems: stewardship, financing, delivery, and human resources. And we have specific recommendations of what countries need to do, and the global health system needs to and should have done, in addition to add and ensure that palliative care and pain relief are effectively a part of universal health coverage. I'll focus on primarily 2 aspects, which is the essential package and access, safe and secure access to opioid medications, and the issue of human resources, lack of general competency, as well as recognized medical and nursing specialties. This is our essential package, developed by a set of palliativists, largely under the leadership of an amazing physician working in palliative care as well, Dr. Eric Krakauer, working with others like Dr. Raj. The essential package has medicines, medical equipment, and human resources, and it formed an essential part of the work of the Disease Control Priorities 3 group that developed an essential UHC package. Now, right at the center of that is morphine. And it's the immediately released oral and injectable morphine that we're talking about, the off-patent, inexpensive kinds of morphine. Why did we focus so much on lack of access to morphine? And this is a quote from Dr. Rajagopal, again, a commissioner and leader in this area. And Raj wrote this testimony. In agonizing, crippling pain from lung cancer, Mr. Eth arrived at the palliative care service in Calicut, Kerala from an adjoining district a couple of hours away, and he arrived by bus. His body language revealed the depth of his suffering. Raj and his team put Mr. S on morphine, among other things, and a couple of hours later, the patient surveyed himself with disbelief because he had neither hoped nor conceived of the possibility that this kind of relief was possible. Mr. S returned the next month, yet common tragedy befell patient and caregivers in the form of a stock out of morphine. And Mr. S told Raj and the team, and Raj quotes, that with outward calm, he said, I shall come again next Wednesday. I will bring a piece of rope with me, and if the tablets are still not here, I am going to hang myself from that tree. Patient pointed to the window, and Raj believed he meant what he said. Stockouts are no longer a problem for palliative care in Kerala. We just heard a lot about why. But throughout most of the rest of India, and indeed our world, we find near total lack of access to morphine to alleviate pain and suffering. We quantified that. And we found, and we had centuries of global health experience brought together in our commission, and we felt that this is one of the most inequitable displays of data or indicator we had ever seen. This is inequity of access to distributed opioid morphine equivalent. The 50% poorest of our world have 1%, and the 10% richest about 90%. And this only got worse with COVID. Here's what the map of access looked like versus need in 2015 when we first drew it. We look at Western Europe as probably a benchmark, and engorged Canada, the United States, and Australia, and the rest of our world largely disappears. Latin America, Africa, Russia, China, Asia, India, very hard to see on our map. And why do I say it got worse? Because in places where there were no access to ICUs, where ventilators were lacking, i.e. in low and middle income countries, was where morphine was most needed. Yet here's another way of looking at what happened over time. And we have data, thanks to the International Narcotics Control Board, up to 2019 here. Low income countries, very low, a tiny sliver. Lower middle, the same. We have to pull them out so you can actually see what's going on for pethidine, codeine, hydromorphone, oxycodone, morphine, and fentanyl. And again, this engorged high income group. But the other that I want you to see in this picture is how countries, yes, have moved away from the largely inferior pethidine and codeine, but towards fentanyl and oxycodone, the more expensive, more problematic, when we're thinking about the opioid crisis, than the morphine that we believe is so needed and we're advocating for. Here is this picture, but now relative to need, serious health-related suffering. These data go until 2017 for now, but it's the same pictures we saw in the map, although perhaps a little bit less vivid, that while things have in fact gotten slightly better in low, lower middle, and upper middle income countries, those numbers are rising. They are still pathetically low in terms of the ability to satisfy need. Yet what are we facing as a world going into the pandemic? This is one example of what hindered in terms of the global health response, what could be done. What I believe was a very sad report from the World Health Organization from two members of the US House of Representatives at the time, put tremendous pressure on WHO, and we believe with inappropriate evidence that was not factual, that was inaccurate and unfair, to take down their guidelines on opioid use, both for children and for adults. So countries went into the pandemic without guidelines in place from the leading organization. Some of that has since been rectified. There are guidelines for children, but a lot of us believe that there are still major issues with the guidelines are going up, and that this was not helpful in any way, and primarily not in going forth into a pandemic. We also know, these are data for 2015, that the price to close the global pain divide is tiny compared to many of the issues in global health, and certainly many other aspects of what countries spend on defense and others. We calculated that to close the global pain divide in 2015 with off-patent morphine, you needed $600 million at prices that were being paid. But it turns out poor countries pay more for these medicines than do wealthy countries. And if poor countries had access to the best prices, something that we can achieve by aggregate financing institutions and global action, we would be looking at 145 million. Put that in context, that's basically the budget of a mid-sized hospital in the United States in any of the states. Very, very small. But clearly, having the medicine is not all of it. Without appropriate training and capacity to manage those medicines, what happens is that they can't be effectively and safely managed. And there's a major problem with human resource training. Data from Mexico show that only a fraction of our medical and nursing schools were offering obligatory or optional courses in palliative care and pain relief. And this is true throughout, particularly the low-income world. We've been thinking about some new ideas about cumulative and multiplicative undervaluation and neglect, a quadruple negative helix that looks at caring and caregiving, gender equality and women also undervalued, palliative care being undervalued, and the alleviation of suffering, and especially that of people who are in turn undervalued, and how that comes back in a negative helix. That means we're undervaluing what is so essential to human beings, which is the alleviation of their suffering. Some of our
so we're running out of time, so another 30 seconds or so, that'd be okay?
God. Yep, last slide, but you're right, I can't see you standing up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Last slide. So we talked about how to increase access to palliative care in low and middle income countries in a commentary produced with Lucas Rajbush and colleagues. In the short term, to take advantage of the INCB simplified fast-track procedures that many countries did, to apply virtual palliative care training, and to organize these global partnerships. But again, we highlighted this need to ensure that teaching and licensing for all health workers included palliative care and pain relief. And I just close with this idea that we've been working on now, which is an economics of hope, that we have to invest in our belief the world can be a much better place. And I think that's central for the many of us who have suffered the sorts of diseases that require access to palliative care and pain relief. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Felicia. For some reason, I can't restart my video, but I'll talk. Thank you. That was really, really fascinating. Thank you for that. Well, there are questions coming in for you already, and I'd encourage others to send in their questions now, because we're just compiling them for the Q&A session. So if you have any final questions you'd like to ask, please get them into the Q&A now. Thank you. Okay, our next speaker is Richard Smith, and Richard is going to talk about or ask the question, are all deaths equal?
Good, thanks a lot, Kamran. So I don't have any slides, so you can see my gigantic face. At the moment, all I can see is Kamran's gigantic face. So my title is, Are All Lives Equal? Well, lives and deaths, same thing really. So I'm going to start off with what is the reality, and then I'm going to talk about what should we aspire to. And in the middle, I'm going to say something about how clinicians deal with whether all lives are equal. Well, clearly lives are not all equal. I mean, almost every single presentation we've had here has made that clear, but I'm going to rattle off a few statistics. So millions of children in low and middle income countries are dying of preventable diseases, when people in high income countries are being given often very expensive and often futile treatments at the end of life. The global difference in life expectancy is 33 years. 84 in Japan, 51 in Zimbabwe. Among men in the UK in the poorest decile live 11 years less than those in the richest decile. More than 2/3 of people in the UK have had at least one COVID-19 vaccine, compared with 2% in Africa, which doesn't augur well for global cooperation on an even bigger problem like climate change. From March to May 2000 in the UK, death rate from COVID among males of Black ethnic background, there were 255 deaths per 100,000, whereas among males from a white ethnic background, there were 87 per 100,000. And at the start of the pandemic, as we know, elderly people in hospital who we knew were likely to be infected were discharged to care homes where the staff, who were often poorly paid, usually female, had little or no PPE compared with staff working in intensive care, many of whom were male and many of whom were extremely highly paid. And as Felicia has just pointed out, many people in low and middle income countries have no access to opioids and basic palliative care, while many in high income countries are being overtreated at the end of life. So somehow things could hardly be worse. But should we aspire to all lives being equal? Well, let me start with a little bit about clinical practice. So when I was a junior doctor in Edinburgh in 1976, people over 40 and people with diabetes were not offered dialysis. And obviously that was primarily because there were very limited resources to dialysis, and it was felt that people who were older and people who had diabetes were not going to do as well as those who were younger and didn't have diabetes or other complications. But was it right that such judgment should be based on clinical judgment? There was a lot of debate about it at the time. So intensive care is sort of the modern equivalent of dialysis because it's a limited resource and decisions have to be made about who's going to be admitted and who isn't. And I vividly remember having dinner in Sydney with the doctor who was in charge of all the intensive care units in Sydney. They were all full. And during the dinner, 3 times he had to get up and have a discussion about whether somebody would be discharged and somebody else would be admitted. So I think this idea that this kind of debate about who's going to go into intensive care only happens around COVID is completely wrong. And it's a principle of intensive care, a bit like with the dialysis, that it should be provided to the patients who are most likely to benefit, which of course means that it's biased towards the young. I remember vividly chairing a session at the International Conference of Intensive Care, where a man from Baragwanath Hospital in Soweto talked about how they use their very limited resources. And they would give priority to young men who suffered gunshot wounds, which made a lot of clinical sense because one minute they were well, the next minute they were at death's door, but intensive care could save them. And I've got some data, I'm not going to show slides, but part of this commission that Felicia mentioned for the Lancet, we've got some data from ICNARC, the Intensive Care National Audit and Research Centre. And we were interested in how many people with less than a 20% chance of surviving were admitted to intensive care in the UK, and they have tremendous data. So between 2009 and 19, there were 95,000 patients with a greater than 80% chance of dying were admitted to intensive care units in the UK, which was about 6.4% of all the admissions. Interestingly, 58% of the admissions were for men. Was that because men were given priority? And the proportion of admissions varied across critical care units from 0, sometimes they didn't admit anybody, to 14.5%. And you wonder why those big variations. We know that we see huge variations in everything in healthcare, but that's a pretty extreme one. And just as you'd expect, 90% of them died. So is that right or wrong? Is the variation acceptable? Seamus quoted Atul Gawande from Being Mortal, his book Being Mortal earlier, about intensive care units becoming warehouses of the dying. And obviously, as we begin to increase the number of beds, which was highly likely to happen after the COVID pandemic, then perhaps we too will end up with intensive care units as warehouses of the dying. And then we also have got some data from low and middle income countries. So in high income countries, there are roughly between 33 and 240 ICU beds per million. So a very big variation, very high in the US, high in Germany, not so high here. But in low and middle income countries, it's only 1 bed per million. So therefore, if you've got fewer resources, you would expect the mortality to be lower because you make sure that you admitted people who were more likely to survive. But in fact, the mortality in high-income countries varies between 8 and 18%, whereas in low and middle-income countries, well, in data from 2 centres in Africa, it was 46% in one and 36% in the other. Why is that? Well, it might be the quality of care, but it's more likely, I think, to be driven by other decisions apart from the capacity to benefit being made by wealth or family or political connections. And then when we think about prevention, breast screening in this country runs for women from 50 to 70, but of course mortality increases with age. People in their 80s have a higher mortality than people in their 50s. And bowel screening runs from 60 to 74, but the incidence is still very high in those in 75 to 90. So the oncologist and bioethicist Zeke Emanuel has written a brilliant article, which I advocate you all read, about why he wants to die at 75. And he insists that he won't have any screening after the age of 65. And he hung up on the doctor who did his PSA test saying, I don't want to know it. You did it for yourself, not for me. Right, now then, should all lives be equal? What should we aspire to? Well, interestingly, in our commission, people said, well, we shouldn't even ask that question. It's just too horrible a question to ask. And for most religions, of course, life is sacred, and whether you live or die is a matter for God. It's not for humans and doctors to decide who shall live and die, even to the point of banning the use of contraception that may prevent life. So I've only got a minute left, is that right, Karen? I should have timed this in advance. So the key question is around age. And there are 3 main arguments why you might, I see you laughing there, Kamran, why you might think that younger people should be given priority. One is the simple thought experiment. And maybe I'll end with that. Because when I look at my 4 grandchildren, aged 2 to 7, and my mother, aged 91, who's been in a care home for 8 years and has no short-term memory and doesn't know who I am, but did have the pleasure of not even realizing there was a COVID pandemic, although she wondered why this strange middle-aged man came to see her in a mask. It's very obvious to me that it's all deaths should not be equal. We have to give priority to the young. Thank you. Sorry I didn't advance.
Richard, thank you very much. Sorry to compress your conclusion there. I'm sure we'll get to hear from you again in the Q&A. We'll move to our final speaker and then it'll be the Q&A. So finally, we'll go to George Davey-Smith. And George is going to tell us about a chronicle of deaths not foretold. George.
Thanks very much, Kamran. Yes, so I'm going to say talk about the consequences of not thinking about what was going to happen with the population, which was aging as dramatically as ours did. And in terms of pandemic planning, one of the consequences of this was that the age of the population who would be struck by the conditions that would arrive, and flu was generally the one that was thought of, wasn't anticipated. They talked about, most of the pandemic plans talked about the 65 plus, and because with influenza, the young are also particularly susceptible or at risk, they're under 5s. But the dramatic steep mortality curve of COVID wasn't taken into account. Care and residential homes as a place where there would be severe outcomes could be considered to be underemphasized, and in particular, hospitals were seen as something that was threatened rather than as an important source of transmission to the very elderly, as they turned out to be. A second consequence I'm going to discuss is the we're all in it together myth. In those COVID briefings, and if we think back to those glorious days when we used to tune in at 4:30 or 5 p.m. to listen to some deadbeat cabinet minister speaking, we heard constantly about how we're all in it together, and that the fact that the Prime Minister could get it and Pink could get it and get ill demonstrated that this was an equal opportunity virus that respects no boundaries of status or geography or vocation. And we're on the side of anyone. The coronavirus doesn't discriminate. As from the data that Danny and others have discussed, of course, we're not all in it together by ethnicity, by a socioeconomic position, but we're also not in it together by age. But this was not recognized. This was a Ipsos Mori poll in May last year, which asked people how personally worried were they about COVID? How was it as a threat to them? And as you can see that on the left, basically there was rather little age segregation, whereas on the right, you see the massive differences in mortality rates by age. So we're all in it together, was taken seriously. It's sort of not surprising that it was taken seriously. This is from one of the documents that SAGE discussed on the 22nd of March 2020, where it was said that the perceived level of personal threat needs to be increased amongst those who are complacent, among the younger complacent, using hard-hitting emotional messaging. And it was successful. And people felt vastly more personally threatened than they were. At the younger age groups, you were much more likely to die. You were more threatened when you went outside the house and maybe crossed the road than you were by COVID to a reasonable age. And in the sort of popular representations of death, The Guardian has run two large-scale sort of tributes to those who died of COVID with photographs, and these are them. And they depicted 190 people. And on the left here is the age distribution of the deaths that The Guardian put in those two spreads. And those spreads were meant to be showing how COVID had hit Britain. And what you see is that the modal age of death of those depicted was around 70, as opposed to well over 80 in reality. And there was massive overrepresentation of the younger and underrepresentation of the older. Indeed, to get the number of, if they'd used representative sampling of the deaths that have been representative of all deaths in England and Wales, they would have needed to depict tens of thousands of people, not 190, to include the number they did up to 39. So that when those sorts of visual presentations obviously have effects on how people consider risk. This is Danny's slide from earlier, looking at the mortality rate per 100,000 people from COVID, where we see this dramatic, incredibly steep rise with age. So going back to thinking over the last century, years we've heard something about, because there were years when there were flu pandemics. What would have happened in those populations with the age distribution that existed at the time if COVID had struck with the mortality rates it has now? Well, in 1919, there would have been 21,000 deaths. In 1957, there would have been 51,000 deaths. In 1968, 61,000 deaths. Whereas now there was 140,000 deaths with that. And the main contributor to that is not the larger population. The main contributor is the huge shift in age distribution. In 1919, it wouldn't have been noticed, not just because it was after the First World War, and in 1957, there was remarkably little was written about the flu pandemic, which occurred in 1957. And the same is true for 68. So there was a dramatic change in the numbers of deaths that would have occurred if COVID had struck. If we look at the deaths in 90 to 94-year-olds, then the sharp declines in mortality rates that Danny had talked about and that Carol talked about is, of course, seen in this age group. And it really is, a sort of remarkable and continuous fall. Now, if the with reasonable assumptions, and we wait till the full data are released, so we don't require to make these assumptions. But the projections for the deaths in the death rates in 2020 and 2021 are as shown here. The two things, this brings forth two things. One is that if you're in that age band, your death rates would have been the same, basically under COVID would have been the same as without COVID in around 2005. I mean, so, you know, to me, if you say, I still sort of think it is 2005, if you say, what's going to happen is we're going to have this pandemic's arrived and it's going to increase your death rate for this year to the death rate that it was in 2005. What sorts of interventions do you want? I think putting it that way would actually focus attention on the effect. And by the time the UN, they bring out these sort of 5-yearly death rates, by the time they actually bring out the 5-yearly combined rate, you probably won't see much effect at all for reasons I will go on to. So this is the proportion of deaths you would have seen with the COVID rates that had struck at different times. So one issue about that is that, you know, the deaths not foretold is that we've got to remember that we never save any lives. We're all going to die. What one can do is delay deaths. And I think the terminology that was used was delaying deaths rather than saving lives. That, again, might actually focus us on reality. Now, here's the first wave of COVID. And what you see in blue is the COVID deaths, and then in red is the excess deaths versus expectation. There was lower deaths than expected up until COVID came. Then during the COVID peak, there was an increase in apparently non-COVID deaths, some of which would have been induced by COVID and would have been misclassified. If we look now, though, we see dramatically the opposite thing. This is in the second wave. We see that the excess deaths are negative and strongly negative and mirror those of the COVID deaths, meaning that the reverse is the case. And most importantly, and something that I don't think the news brings to people's attention, is since February, we've had negative excess deaths, i.e. we've had lower deaths than anticipated. And that is almost certainly because some of the deaths that have happened earlier would have happened now, but are delayed. And this fact is brought to attention by looking at the age-specific COVID deaths as they occurred, and then the excess or the negative excess that we've seen early on. And what you see is that those reflect the age patterns, demonstrating quite clearly that these are delayed deaths. So my last slide is the consequences of the deaths not foretold. It's the downside of success, obviously, that people are living longer, but because the deaths are less and less experienced, many people my age, the parents are both still alive. They don't, they haven't actually had a close death. And the old age and decline are partly hidden. My mother, like Richard's mother, was in a care home for 9 years, not recognizing me at the end of it, would not be seen by anyone. And the denial of death and decay is encouraged by this hiding of this. And I think the trade-off of lives versus lives, we shouldn't think of lives versus the economy. We should think of lives versus lives. If you have the forms of social exclusion or social restrictions which are imposed, you never gain them again. If you're an 85-year-old, you're never going to have that year that you might have seen your grandchildren again. And the trade-offs has to be one's total life that is changed versus some delayed death. And to finish with a quote by Bernard Henry Levy, "A life is not a life if it is merely life." Thank you. You're muted, Kamran.
You missed all the great stuff there, George. Thank you so much. That was really fascinating, George. Some really fascinating data for us to mull over. It's been a very powerful session. We've had some incredibly evocative experiences shared, both personal and working experiences, but also some very powerful data presented. I'm going to go straight to questions now. Nikki, my colleague at the BMJ. Nikki, are you there? You've been marshalling the questions, and I'm welcoming back the panel. Nikki, tell us what our first question is.
Of course. So our first question is, if governments had focused on reducing suffering rather than reducing deaths during the pandemic, would the response have looked very different? And was it right to prioritise reducing deaths?
Okay, so I guess on suffering, we'll go to Felicia first. Felicia.
So I would argue that extending life when people are in extreme pain and agony is, as George said at the end, is not really extending life in a way that many would want. And forcing some people to experience tremendous pain and suffering because others are able to live slightly longer is not certainly a choice or a way of prioritizing that I would have suggested was the way to do this. But let me also answer in the context of what I think needs to be done about it, which is that as far as we can see, none of the priority setting mechanisms in global health actually value the alleviation of suffering. They're all about extending life or making people more productive. And something as simple and extremely important as ensuring that a child with cancer isn't in pain versus not in pain is not valued in any way that comes out in our metrics. So we need new metrics.
Felicia, thank you. I think I'll take one more response on this because we've got a good number of questions now, I think. Would anybody else like to add anything to what Felicia said? Okay. In that case, let's go to the next question, Nikki. Felicia, you covered that. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So our next question is, human rights were ignored, including the right to family life by lockdown rules for over a year in all settings, resulting in loss of care, visits and support. Was lockdown too harsh? And what should or could have been done better? And then how do we repair the harms that have been done and are still happening?
Okay. Do I have anybody who'd like to take that one? George.
So I guess I'm partly in response to the first question. The sort of rule for sort of public health interventions is you've got to consider the downsides and of any intervention, as well as considering the benefit. I mean, if it's medical treatment, you would consider that, and if it's a population health intervention, you need to do that in that situation as well. I think a pandemic, an arriving pandemic, isn't the sort of time to start having a discussion about what sorts of things society will tolerate or will tolerate to avoid deaths, and will tolerate to avoid the direct effects of the pandemic. I think it was impossible to have the discussion then. And thus things, the interventions are made. I think that the lesson of this pandemic is that we need to have that conversation about that needs to be a sort of social conversation about what the balances really are of benefits and harms. And I mean, I think the first place you would look to have that discussion would be closure of schools. I think everyone has agreed that the last thing you want to do is basically close schools, especially for leading to changes in kids' lives, which will simply never be ameliorated. For some, and the kids kids obviously in the poorest social circumstances, kids whose parents have to go out to work, for whom homeschooling is a bit of a bad joke, as opposed to the people who the delivery drivers are turning up at and dropping off their books and stuff. So I think we need to have that conversation, but you can't have it during an emergency, which is why I sort of say, call it death's not foretold.
Yeah, I mean, just to say to the panel, if you'd like to add anything, just raise your hand either physically or use the icon and the button to do so. I'm going to go to Carol. I'll come to you, Carol, next. Just to say that it seems that the crisis, we seem to unable to address these questions until the crisis is upon us. It's very similar with climate change. I mean, it's almost we're programmed not to work in the way we need to. But Carol, what do you have to say?
Well, I think that the discussion about death and the place of death is incredibly important in this, and we have a national narrative that and during the pandemic it was every death is a tragedy, and it's much more complicated than that. And I think that what we really must have is a discussion at societal level on life, expectation of health in later life and well-being, and the fact that we do all die, and also to bring the evidence base. I mean, there is a very good, and we've heard it today, a wonderful evidence base, which is about the knowledge about the dying process within this country and internationally, and what can be done. And I couldn't agree more with Felicia about the need for improvement of the metrics. Because pain is often sort of just painted out of the picture. It isn't included in research studies as an automatic thing. And I think that's a really important gap.
Thank you. Kate, over to you. So you're on mute. Sorry. Yeah.
It's almost impossible to be allowed to die. I mean, my parents' deaths was a timely death. That's something I have to keep saying to people over and over again. And they tell me, oh, your family is ripped apart. Well, I know what death in a family, how that can rip apart a family. The death of somebody in their 30s or 40s, or death of a child. The death of grandparents brings the family together. But my parents were caused enormous suffering by lockdown, by the kind of physical, the literal shunning of them out of the community. That certainly caused them great depression and feeling of worthlessness. And that's not written down anywhere. They certainly would rather have died at the beginning of the pandemic. They certainly would never, they were horrified by what was happening to their grandchildren. And they were horrified by the presumption that went on and on and on, that all they wanted from a hospital was to have their death prevented, when really what they wanted was to have their suffering prevented.
Yes. Kate, thank you. I think Felicia wants to add something. You're on mute, Felicia. Sorry.
Thank you. Sorry. Quickly, just related to what Kate said, I think we know that watching a loved one die in pain that could be alleviated is a direct cause of complex grief and much more difficult bereavement that requires additional kinds of care, including palliative care. And so it increases need in all sorts of ways to have people have complex, unnecessarily painful deaths.
Yeah. Richard, I think you had.
What about not seeing them die?
Oh, sorry.
That's actually what I would say that was worse. Watching my father die, I went through quite a bit of pain. That was bad. But knowing that my mother was being held somewhere where I was not allowed to see her and where I might or might not get bulletins. I think that is, I mean, I had the feeling of being broken down, that I would have told them anything, that I was being tortured. And actually, I think it is a torture technique to say, we've taken your relatives and we've put them somewhere and we're going to put them through pain and we're going to, tell you about them sometimes.
Yes.
That wasn't, I mean, that was not a benefit. And what it does to a family, I think we're going to take a long time to say.
Yeah. Richard, I think you wanted to add something, and then we'll go to another question. Richard.
I mean, we talk all the time about the fact that we're living longer is a great success, but I'm far from convinced it is. If I think of my own parents, I mean, my father, who was at the Battle of El Alamein, smoked all his life, died a magnificent death at home at 81 after a few weeks of disease. In contrast, as I said, my mother, who actually wrote a letter saying, if I developed dementia as her mother did, I would, I'd like to have a sister dying, which we haven't talked about in this conversation. And if you read Zeke Emanuel's thing, I think he makes a very powerful case that 75 is a pretty good age to die. So I sometimes feel like congratulating people who die of cancer at 75, because it's not a bad way to go. You know, it's fairly quick and you can say goodbye. But he says, you know, as we get older, we decay, people get fed up with us, we feel miserable, everything kind of goes to hell. Whereas if we die at 75, I mean, I'm 69, 6 years off, that goes pretty well. So I'm not convinced that extending life is in itself of any benefit. And there are people out there, you know, literally pursuing immortality and spending lots of money doing it.
Mm. Okay, thank you. I will go to another question. Perhaps I'm sure we'll touch on these themes as we discuss this. Nikki, what's next?
Yeah, of course. So the next question is, has the pandemic changed the way we think about a good death? And if so, how?
Okay, thanks. I guess that's building on what Richard just mentioned. Would any of the other panel members like to take that on who haven't yet had a chance to speak? What's a good death in India? Thanks, Suresh.
Yeah, I think I can talk from like India whenever I cannot talk from, because India is a very, it's like a vast place with multiple. From Kerala's experience, I can talk about like definitely like it is again Kerala has been, in a way, we have been defining palliative care in a slightly different way than many other places. We've been going beyond clinical care and redefining care as care, which involves social support and other issues, and part of it as clinical care. Something that has happened in Kerala, which when I look on this, is that like the COVID somehow suddenly brought the dominant clinical narrative, the clinical dialogue, or the discourse into in a very dominant way, like because over the time there was this is a system of community-based support evolving, people being kept at home care being provided, and then support, other social support, emotional support, and also a lot of social visits and that sort of atmosphere. And suddenly this struck, and then the narrative was actually taken away. Like the people are talking about COVID, getting COVID infection, getting admitted in the hospital, dying in the hospital, dying in the ICU. So I think the social dimension of care got. I don't know what happened in many other places. In Kerala, this was very obvious. Like suddenly the way you die, like everything else was sort of made unimportant. So I think this is, and also the grief and bereavement, which I mentioned, like the conventional way. So this has made, I cannot call it a good death, but this has made the way people die totally different, and the social, the way you look at it, totally different.
Thanks, Suresh. I've got Danny and Laura. I'll come to you in a second. So one of the notable features of Kerala's response, from the outside at least, was the community provision, the community involvement. And I think Richard raised the point about the community provision of end-of-life care in Kerala. Can you say a little more about that to us?
Yeah, again, this is something connected with what I was already mentioning. Like the way the Kerala has a very strong, a very good network of palliative care in the community, led by local people, and with the clinical care as part of it. It's not led by the clinical team. It's led by local volunteers. So the whole like the paradigm was actually totally shifted from even when people sometimes talk about integrating into primary health, palliative into primary health care and all, the usual assumption is that you get it integrated into primary clinical care. You're not talking about primary care beyond clinical care. So here, something that has evolved over the time. Thanks, it was not deliberate, but thanks to the involvement of local people, the way they look at suffering, health-related suffering, and the role that they play, the model that's evolved in Kerala is actually clinical care as part of the general supportive care, and the palliative care in Kerala again, like irrespective of the diagnosis and the better social care. So that is something different from. We have been trying to do this in some of the other places also with some success. But I think the definition of care has been. I think this is better definition and better approach to it rather than just approaching it.
Okay, Suresh, thank you. I've got Laura and then Danny. Laura.
Yeah, I think what has just been highlighted is that having a good death is not just about the physical condition of the dying, but there is also a whole social dimension. So about managing to successfully perform funeral rituals. And this is something that we see all over the world. And so this is something that has not been mentioned in detail yet, but something that was particularly traumatic for people was not being able to have a proper funeral or a funeral where relatives could attend. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight that because I remember reading the personal witness of somebody saying that because they were not able to attend the funeral of their relatives, they almost felt like the death had not happened. So they were not able to fully come to terms with the fact that the death had taken place.
Yeah. Laura, thanks. Danny?
I think it's worth thinking to what extent this experience has massively increased fear of death amongst a large number of people who haven't thought about it at all. The image of the pandemic that I have in my mind is a young person in the middle of a field walking across wearing a mask, many, many dozen meters away from anybody else. And you have to sort of think what kind of fear has led to this. And of course, we haven't talked about illness, but they also have the fear of illness. Now, the worst thing you can do to try to reduce that fear is to tell that young person of the 100 causes they're now more likely to die of, because all that happens then is they become even more fearful. And my point about trying to make this is people like some of us who, look at data about death and have dealt with death a lot in my case, for 3 decades. We've been very used to it. And it's been a real shock, I think, to discover what happens when you expose the populations, particularly of rich countries, where we've hidden things away in crematoria and hidden them away in nursing homes. What happens when, after many decades, apart from AIDS, which was a particular subset of the population, what happens when you do this? And I think it's absolutely shocking, and I don't know how long it's going to take out. The last thing I'll say is there's a huge variation. Some of us are much less fearful than others, but there is a subset who are so incredibly fearful that fear may last for decades with them, long after this pandemic has finished.
Thanks, Danny. George, you shared some data. I'll come to you now. Bettina, just to warn you, I'd like just to ask you about Norway after George has spoken. George.
Just Danny's point about dealing with death for 30 years. Maybe one test for Sheldon's terror management theory is to look at epidemiologists who indeed daily are reminded of death as they sort of actually do their do their chi-squads. It's very difficult to be an epidemiologist and not to think about death very often.
Yeah. Thanks, George. Bettina, what can we learn from Norway?
A good death in Norway is actually a timely, not prolonged death. We conducted interviews with people with dementia, what they are thinking about end-of-life care and what they wish for the rest of their lives. And they told us that they would appreciate staying at home and being there with their relatives, perhaps with a husband who already died 20 years ago, but they argued that home is the only thing that they are able to handle. They are only competent on their home. However, we know that 98% of all people with dementia are dying in a nursing home. And we know that the coordination reform reduced death at home from 15 to 10%. And only 6% of all deaths in Norway are prepared death at home. So we have a huge problem because we are on the bottom compared to all other countries. And at the same time, we know that most people would prefer to stay at home longer. And in future, we have to find new solutions because we do not have the money for all this institutional care. So death should be a larger topic in daily discussions, in the families, in the healthcare system, and we have to prepare for smarter solutions. But of course, people should not suffer by pain or symptoms, and they should die with dignity in their individual way.
Okay.
And we should not prolong it unnecessarily.
Yeah. Thanks, Bettina. Sheldon, is there anything you'd like to add before we go to another question?
No, just to second everything that the more qualified folks have been talking about. I will say that as an egghead experimental psychologist, we are now in the process of trying to study changes in death anxiety over time as a function of different demographic variables. And one thing I will toss in is that we're looking at both explicit death anxiety, through self-report, as well as implicit measures of death anxiety. My colleague Tom Pazinski has some preliminary data suggesting that the most difficult outcomes is when there's a discrepancy. You can say that you're not afraid of death, and yet implicitly be quite afraid, or the other way around. And at least in some initial data, it's the degree of discrepancy between conscious and unconscious death anxiety that appears to predict non-optimal outcomes.
Thanks, Sheldon. Nikki.
We've also got a problem.
Sorry, no, yes, go ahead.
We've also got a problem that we've associated very, very great fearfulness with public virtue. So that boy that Danny was describing going across the field is much admired by his parents and other people for being a very good boy and being very, very, mask wearing, being very fearful, particularly on anyone who's left wing in this country, is a position of great virtue. And people go on, on social media about how especially cautious they are. And there's been a great plague of sanctimony, which is associated not with, lack of adultery, for example. There is that as well, but with wearing, gelling your hands as you go into a supermarket. And I think that sanctimony is going to take a very long time to go away, because we've validated what we previously would have thought was neurotic behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. Nikki, another question.
Yeah, of course. So if medical research cures all disease, then what will we die of?
Okay, we're getting on to the philosophical questions now. Any volunteers for this? Oh yes, Carol, well done. Oh, your cat wants to answer that.
Yes, yeah, they're kittens.
Oh, kittens, all right.
They're very demanding.
Okay.
Well, yes, I think it's a really interesting question, because what we see in the oldest old, who are the kind of extreme ages, is that although they may develop dementia and various accrued illnesses later, they also have tremendous sensory deprivation, sensory impairment, and so on. So the issue about the quality of life with extreme age is a very, very important one, and the accrual of disease. So there is a huge debate about the underlying gerontological, so as it were, the aging process and the acquisition of different diseases. And a lot of the life sciences research at the moment is aimed at potentially changing those fundamental aging processes. But it does mean medicating the population from a very early age. So there are incredibly important implications to this, which need to be tackled at the societal level, because we need to have a societal discussion about what it means to extend life without knowing that it has quality, and also what it means for the younger generations, for the upcoming generations behind us, whether we want to die, whether we want to extend our lives or not. So I'm not really answering the question, but because it's a huge area of research at the moment and has been for decades.
Yeah, thank you. Would anyone else like to take that on? Richard.
Well, I asked this question to a series of leaders of medical research, And they had rather clever answers, because they say, well, we are trying to cure all diseases, but we don't think we'll cure all of them. So there will be some left to die of. So then I said, well, if we are going to cure all diseases, what are we going to die of? And their answer was, really, we're going to compress morbidity so that we'll all be ripping along until we're 85, and then we'll just fall apart over a few weeks. But I think that looks to me like wishful thinking rather than reality.
Can I just come back in on that?
Yes, please do. You're saying no with your head.
There's effectively, I mean, there's such good evidence on terminal decline. So all of the work that we've done, which follows people right up to death, and then we interview their relatives or friends after death, their close ones, their loved ones. And there is clearly a terminal decline phase. And in that, there is very clearly cognitive decline and functional decline. And so it seems to me that it's very highly unlikely that we will ever avoid some, well, that, as it were, inevitable approaching death angle, however much we pick off the individual diseases.
Yeah. Thank you. Nikki, have you got any other burning questions? Otherwise, I've got one, which I'll ask.
You go for it. Yeah.
All right. Okay. I think perhaps we'll make this the last one. Then we'll give you all a chance to say your final words. I mean, several themes have emerged. I mean, over-medicalization, inequalities very strongly, but also I think George presented the data on how COVID had differentially affected older people. But then if I go back to Danny's presentation, and we're all aware of this, is it an anomaly? I don't know. If we look at the data from the populations of East Asia, it questions that association to some degree, and doesn't quite, make the case a convincing one. And I mean, Danny, you said that there's an explanation, that there's a possible explanation for this, but it's not clear what it is. I'm just wondering, if we're saying that there is a strong relationship with age in certain populations, in certain parts of the world, why wasn't that evident? Isn't that evident in what we're seeing on a population level in East Asia?
We are waiting to find out.
Okay.
And that is because if suddenly mortality rises in one of those, there are about 19 East Asian countries with very low mortality, if suddenly it rises now, it could simply be that the latest variant does spread more easily. The standard answer is, these Southeast Asian countries are so good at social population control. But this includes Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Mongolia. That doesn't make sense. The other thing I think well worth saying, when you were talking earlier about lockdown and the effect of lockdown, I think it's really worth remembering that Europe locked down in response to seeing how effective lockdown was in China and assuming it would just be similar. And that assumption carried on quite a long time. If you remember people talking about how much lower the rate was in Germany and these stereotypes, those Germans, they're well behaved, aren't they? That kind of thing. And it wasn't until the second wave when you suddenly realised, and we have similar rates in at least mortality in Germany and the UK now. So this is a genuine, we are waiting to see. And the story of the pandemic will not be told until it is largely over. All pandemics of this kind end in 2, 3, 4 years. This one should end slightly faster because of the vaccines. It is terrible that we're not distributing them where they're most needed, rather than arguing about giving them to our children when it's not going to save any lives, when we could be giving exactly those same vaccines to elderly people elsewhere in the world. But once this comes to an end and we look back, we will be telling such a different story than the one we're telling in the middle of the fear and the panic right now.
Okay, thanks, Danny. Would anybody else like to try and answer that question? Perhaps it's more too complicated. As Danny says, we're waiting for the data. Okay, I'm going to ask you all now to very briefly give us your final thoughts. And I'm going to begin with Suresh.
Okay, something that's emerged during the pandemic, like they started saying, is that like it also revealed a lot of strength, weaknesses, and it's also like shed light on the way we were thinking about healthcare, the inequalities, and also like it made a lot of things very clear, like in black and white, rather than many of the things which are in abstract. And I think that's also a good learning for mankind. Like how are we approaching death? What about the marginalized group? The disadvantaged group? Like this is a double whammy on them. Like how this is happening. So I think it brought a lot of stuff into light, and both at the philosophical level and also the practical level. And I think something that we learned, and so there is no going back from there.
Okay, Suresh, thank you. Seamus, we haven't heard from you in a while. Any final thoughts?
Final thought on the idea of the good death is talked a lot about now, and there are even tick boxes that tick box criteria to almost quantify the quality of dying. And I'm a little dubious about the notion of the good death as something that is, achievable. And I'm also concerned that one person's idea of a good death may not be another's. It's hugely subjective and poorly understood, and probably not a generalizable concept. So I have a sort of deep suspicion about the idea of the good death. It varies across not only people, but cultures and age groups and countries and so on. So that's my final thought. And thanks for involving me in this very interesting debate today. Thanks.
Thank you, Seamus. Sheldon.
Thank you, everybody. I thought this was informative and uplifting, and highlights, just to put in a plug, I enjoyed Richard Horton's book on the COVID-19 catastrophe, and not that everyone needs to agree with me, but I like how he tried to recast some of these concerns by proposing that they're much more than medical issues, and that ideally maybe these kinds of tragedies will convince enough of us to step back and to consider these issues from broader perspectives. And so thank you very much for inviting me.
Great, thanks, Sheldon. Bettina.
I suggest, or we suggest, that home care services are the backbone of the healthcare system. And they have not been prioritized in the last years. So since COVID-19, people do not want to be admitted to a nursing home, and they want to stay at home. And it's our duty to support these people living at home with chronic complex conditions, including dementia. And it is our duty to focus on, of course, palliative care, but also on the implementation of smart devices and smart technology, and to test it in these people who are living at home, because there are a lot of people who need more attention, better care, better treatment, so that they increase their own responsibility. And this is very important for the healthcare system, that elderly people, recognize that they have the responsibility for their own life and for their own time when they are getting older. It's not only the healthcare system, but it's their own responsibility that we have to support and that we have to make clear for these people, including ourselves. We are responsible for our own health, and yes, to prepare our age in a better manner.
Great, thanks, Bettina. Danny, thank you.
My last thought is there's a particular importance of learning from this pandemic. People often say that we're going to get more and more pandemics with climate change or population, but the actual frequency of pandemics of this kind over time has been slowing down. We had a huge number in the 19th century, cholera and so on. And then in the last century, 1918, 1957, 1968. But then we've gone for decades without a pandemic of this kind. it is quite possible we might go for decades without one again. So if we don't learn from this one and find a way of preserving some good message from it, when this does happen again, we could easily go through this exactly the same and make all the mistakes again. And we overestimate our ability as experts in human beings to deal with this kind of thing. The disagreements between epidemiologists now are incredible, which shows you really what we don't know. And only very rarely do we reveal what we don't know when something like this happens, because we're ever so good at pretending that we really know everything that's going on.
Thank you. I think that's the perfect place to end the webinar. I want to thank everybody, all the participants, all the panelists, all the attendees for joining us and staying with us to the end. I think we've learned a lot over the last 2.5 hours. So thank you all again for that. I want to thank the organisers, George Davey Smith, Allyson, Pollock, and my colleagues at the BMJ, Nikki and David, and of course Richard Smith, who helped put this whole session together. We do hope that you will watch the video. If you want to watch all this again, it'll be available on YouTube almost immediately as this webinar finishes. You can watch all the ones previously as well that we've published, and do join us for the next webinar, which will be on September the 9th, and that is on the very topical question of vaccination in children. So on the behalf of the BMJ, thank you all very much.